Imagine walking into your local supermarket one morning and noticing that everything, from bread to batteries, costs noticeably more than it did a month ago. You glance at the gas prices on your way home, and they've jumped again. The news mentions rising interest rates, shrinking company profits, and waves of layoffs. Suddenly, you begin to wonder, are we heading toward another global recession? It's a question that's been hanging over the world economy like a dark cloud in recent months. With slowing growth in major economies, persistent inflation, and mounting debt, many economists are warning that a new downturn might be closer than we think. But how real is this threat? And if another recession is indeed on the horizon, what exactly would it mean for you, your job, and your savings? Let's start by unpacking what a recession actually is. In simple terms, a recession is when an economy stops growing and starts shrinking for an extended period. Usually 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. It means businesses produce less, unemployment rises, and consumer spending falls. It's like a domino effect. When people spend less, companies earn less, they hire fewer workers, and confidence in the economy drops further. The last major global recession hit in 2008 after the US housing market collapsed, triggering a financial crisis that spread across the world. Millions lost jobs, banks failed, and governments had to inject trillions of dollars to stabilize the system. More recently, the world faced another sharp downturn in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic brought global trade and travel to a halt. But what makes today's situation different and potentially more complicated is that the problems we're facing now are coming from multiple directions at once. First, there's inflation, the silent thief of purchasing power. Over the last few years, inflation surged to levels not seen in decades. The US, for example, saw inflation hit over 9% in 2022, while countries in Europe and Latin America faced even higher spikes. Initially, governments and central banks blamed supply chain disruptions from the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, which sent energy and food prices soaring. But even as those pressures began to ease, inflation stayed stubbornly high. To fight inflation, central banks, including the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and others, responded by raising interest rates aggressively. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive. That means businesses delay investments, homebuyers hold off on mortgages, and consumers cut back on credit card spending. This cooling effect can help bring inflation down, but it also slows economic growth. In other words, the same medicine used to treat inflation can sometimes push the patient, our economy, into a recession. We've already begun to see the effects. In the United States, corporate bankruptcies have risen in 2024 as small and mid-sized firms struggle with higher debt costs. Europe has teetered on the edge of stagnation for months, with Germany, the region's largest economy, experiencing multiple quarters of near-zero growth. In China, the world's second-largest economy, a property market crisis and declining exports have dampened consumer confidence. When the 3 biggest economic engines, the US, China, and Europe, are all slowing down simultaneously, the risk of a global recession becomes much harder to ignore. But the situation isn't black and white. There are reasons for cautious optimism, too. Job markets in several advanced economies remain surprisingly strong, and consumer spending, though cooling, hasn't collapsed. In the US, unemployment has stayed below 4% for most of 2025, and wages are slowly catching up with inflation. This resilience has led some analysts to argue that what we're seeing isn't a recession, but rather a long, uneven recovery from the shocks of the pandemic and war. Still, others point to warning signs that can't be ignored. The International Monetary Fund recently trimmed its global growth forecast to around 2.6%, well below the historical average. Manufacturing output is contracting in many countries, trade volumes are shrinking, and household debt is rising faster than incomes. Even emerging economies, which often drive global expansion, are facing pressure from a strong US dollar. When the dollar strengthens, it makes it more expensive for developing countries to pay back loans and import goods priced in dollars, creating a financial squeeze. Let's take a closer look at what's happening behind the scenes. The heart of today's global uncertainty lies in policy choices. Central banks are walking a tightrope between controlling inflation and keeping growth alive. If they keep rates high for too long, they risk freezing the economy. If they cut them too soon, inflation could flare up again. Governments, meanwhile, face their own balancing act. trying to stimulate growth through spending without worsening already massive public debt. For example, the US national debt recently surpassed $35 trillion. Interest payments alone now consume a significant portion of the federal budget. In Europe, fiscal constraints are limiting how much governments can invest in green energy and innovation. And in China, the government is battling to restore confidence in its housing and stock markets after years of overbuilding and speculation. These competing pressures make coordinated global action difficult, something we desperately need in a connected world economy. Then there's the geopolitical angle. Wars, trade disputes, and shifting alliances have added another layer of complexity. The Russia-Ukraine conflict continues to disrupt energy markets. The Israel-Gaza war has heightened tensions in the Middle East, risking supply shocks in oil and gas. Meanwhile, the US and China remain locked in a strategic rivalry that's reshaping global supply chains. Companies are de-risking by moving production away from China to countries like India, Vietnam, and Mexico. While this may reduce dependence on a single region, it also increases costs and uncertainty in the short term. All of these factors together have created a fragile global environment, where even a small shock could trigger a larger economic slide. That's why economists are watching key indicators closely. Yield curve inversions, rising credit defaults, and falling consumer confidence. Historically, these have been reliable early warning signs of recession. So, what does all this mean for everyday people? A recession isn't just about stock markets or government budgets. It hits real lives. If growth slows, companies reduce hiring or lay off staff. Wages stagnate while living costs remain high. Borrowing becomes harder, and investments like homes or retirement savings may lose value. However, it's also a time when opportunities arise. For example, long-term investors often find bargains in down markets, and people who save during uncertain times can come out stronger once recovery begins. Economists like to remind us that recessions are a natural part of the economic cycle. They cleanse excesses and reset the system, but that doesn't make them painless. What's different now is that the world has less room to maneuver. Interest rates are already high, debts are massive, and political divisions are deep. That means the next downturn, if it comes, could play out differently than in the past, possibly slower and more uneven, with some regions hurting more than others. So, are we headed for another global recession? The honest answer is, it's possible, but not inevitable. The outcome will depend on how policymakers manage this delicate balance between growth and inflation, and whether the world can navigate geopolitical tensions without further economic shocks. If central banks can bring inflation down gradually without crushing demand, and if governments can focus spending on productivity and innovation instead of short-term relief, the world might avoid a full-blown recession. But if inflation remains sticky, debt piles up, or another major crisis hits, the global economy could easily slip into another downturn. For now, the best approach for individuals and investors is to stay informed, cautious, and flexible. Build an emergency fund, reduce high-interest debt, and diversify investments. History shows that economies do recover, sometimes stronger than before, but those who prepare early often fare the best. The global economy may be slowing, but it's also transforming. New industries like artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and digital finance are reshaping growth patterns worldwide. The future may be uncertain, but one thing is clear: the choices made today, by governments, businesses, and individuals, will determine whether we slide into another recession or step into a new era of sustainable growth. In the end, every economic storm eventually passes. The key is to be ready when it does, because those who understand the cycle don't just survive it, they find ways to thrive through it.